Welcome to A Quaker Take, a podcast from Quakers in Britain and Woodbrook, exploring a Quaker perspective on the world.
I'm John.
And I'm Elizabeth.
This is the second of our series of podcasts exploring reparations.
In this episode, we're going to look at how reparations have been used in the past. We're going to look at some examples, some different definitions, the relationship to justice, different countries around the world that have looked at reparations, that kind of thing.
So I guess we go straight into our first interview. Who were you speaking to, Elizabeth?
So I was talking again to Edwina and Rebecca, who we spoke to in part one of this episode. And I was also speaking to Oonagh Ryder, who was the campaigns coordinator for Quakers in Britain around that time.
Excellent. Well, over to you with them now.
So we're having a chat again about reparations, kind of following on from our last episode. Do you want to just introduce yourselves again for the listeners?
Hi, I'm Edwina.
Hi, I'm Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Oonagh. I wasn't here for the last episode, but I'm here for this one, and I am Faith and Action Coordinator.
And you've got 3 examples that you're going to share. So we're just going to play those now.
So, when I was researching German reparations after the Second World War, the first thing that occurred to me, or the first thing that was obvious, was that Europe has a long history of making one party in a war pay compensation to another. And this payment changed from indemnities to reparations. And the idea is that indemnity was more punitive. Reparations would be less so. So reparations were paid for the Napoleonic War, the Franco-Prussian War, and for the First World War as well as the Second. And interestingly, the case and the amounts of compensation demanded were often held in peace treaties. There's a recognition that Germany extracted payments from the countries it occupied, that it stole and destroyed property, that it used forced labour and extracted resources. And so it was required to compensate for these actions. And the term actually expanded beyond compensation for war costs to include payments to the State of Israel for crimes committed against Jewish people in territories controlled by the Third Reich, and also payments to individuals for persecution suffered. Interestingly, acceptance of reparations was contested, and it was contested within Israel. It had to be carefully negotiated. It changed over time, and a process evolved. So we can see from this example that reparations can refer to payments in cash or in kind for services and goods or in capital. So in this specific example, the US vigorously pursued harvesting, and I want you to note the use of that word, harvesting, technological and scientific knowledge, including patents and scientists. And it's referred to in some spaces as intellectual reparations. All forms of reparations are complex. The other thing that jumped out for me was that the size or the magnitude of the reparations is determined by the defeated country or country's ability to pay. So when we're thinking about reparations, we have to think about how much are you able to give? So we're thinking about national wealth and income. We're also thinking about the other side's ability to receive payments. Germany's reparations also included a commitment to truth-telling. The whole story had to be retold from more than one perspective, and they also had to outlaw the Nazi Party. And part of that included erecting memorials and establishing landmarks across the country.
Another example of reparations you've probably never heard of is Haiti. Like Germany, the reparations related to a period of conflict, except in this case, it was the liberated peoples of Haiti who were coerced into paying reparations to their former colonial enslavers for lost income. In the 1700s, Haiti was colonized by France. Known as Saint-Domingue during this time, it was the wealthiest European colony in the world. Saint-Domingue's productivity accounted for 1/3 of French overseas trade and 40% of all sugar traded in the Atlantic markets. But in 1791, the enslaved people of Haiti organized the first and only successful slave revolt in modern history. In the following years, the young nation sought to establish its independence. But, unwilling to accept the loss of the colony, in 1825, King Charles X of France sent an armed flotilla of warships carrying more than 500 cannons to Haiti, demanding 150 million francs in return for recognizing its independence. Allegedly, this sum reflected calculations of proper restitution for France's destroyed wealth and commercial ventures in Saint-Domingue. Failure to pay would result in the warships laying siege to the island. In other words, Haiti had no choice but to pay. And to put this sum in context, it was 10 times the amount President Jefferson paid for the Louisiana Purchase, and also 10 times Haiti's annual budget. Newspaper articles from the time show that King Charles X knew this, and many around the world thought the sum was absurd. A British journalist writing in the Times that year noted that the enormous price constituted a sum which few states in Europe could bear to sacrifice. It took the next 122 years for Haiti to repay this sum, which it was forced to do so by taking out loans from French financial institutions. Crippled by interest payments on top of the sum, modern-day estimates of the total amount Haiti paid to France range from 20 to 30 billion US dollars. This amount is believed to be twice the original sum demanded by King Charles X. Unsurprisingly, it was Haitians who suffered as a result of France's flagrant theft. Researchers have found that the independence debt and the resulting drain on the Haitian treasury were directly responsible not only for the underfunding of education in 20th century Haiti, but also the lack of healthcare and the country's inability to develop public infrastructure. Haiti's subsequent story is one repeated in many countries across the global south. Despite being the poorest country in the Americas, Haiti was not considered for debt relief when the heavily indebted Poor Countries HIPC initiative was launched in 1996. It took 10 more years for the World Bank to accept Haiti was poor enough to be considered. A deeply flawed process, the HIPC forced countries to adopt harmful economic policy conditions imposed by the International Monetary Fund. And of course, there was no recognition about how Haiti got into the debt in the first place. Many will remember when a devastating earthquake hit Haiti in 2010 and 250,000 people died. As Haitians turned to emergency relief and longer-term reconstruction, 26 Haitian NGOs called urgently for debt cancellation. The global outcry eventually forced international finance institutions to drop Haiti's outstanding debt. But despite many calls for support, there was a huge shortfall in funding needed to recover and reconstruct. New reconstruction funds were offered in the form of loans rather than grants, resulting in Haiti being forced to take on yet more debt to rebuild. Meanwhile, calls for France to repay the 20 to 30 billion that it stole from Haiti as disaster relief were ignored by the French government. But Haiti's case for reparations for the theft is not just limited to the past. Haiti is also an example of a formerly colonized country trapped in cycles of debt that is facing the brunt of climate breakdown. With the increasing frequency of extreme weather events, Haitians are now also contending with losses and damage caused by wealthy nations' use of the world's carbon budget.
Reparations aren't often included in the mainstream narrative about Britain's history, but there is one important example that still shapes wealth in our society today. When slave ownership was abolished in Britain in 1833, the British government paid out huge sums of money in reparations, not to the enslaved people, but to the slave owners as compensation for what was understood as the loss of their property. The total of all the payments came to £20 million. This figure represented 40% of the Treasury's annual spending budget at the time, and in today's terms equates to around £16.5 billion. In fact, because the amount was so large, the government had to borrow money in order to make the payments, and this debt wasn't fully paid off until 2015. This fact was brought to light by a tone-deaf tweet from the Treasury in 2020, posting an infographic explaining the debt with a cheerful tagline, "Here's today's surprising Friday fact. Millions of you helped end the slave trade through your taxes." The tweet was deleted shortly afterwards. Researchers at University College London have painstakingly compiled records of all the payments made to slave owners by the government and created an online database which anyone can use to search the names of families or institutions to find out whether they received payments for being slave owners. Through this, we can better understand the relationship between slavery and Britain's modern economy, seeing that much of the capital used to develop Britain's companies and infrastructure came directly from slavery, and that many of the most wealthy British people are at least in part wealthy because their ancestors benefited not only from owning enslaved people, but then again from the so-called reparations paid to them upon the abolition of slave ownership.
So you've each given an example, 3 specific examples there, of different forms of reparations. And particularly in the context of Haiti and of Germany, those 2 examples seem in particular to be as a result of extracting as a punishment as a result of revolution and war. And I wonder what that means in the context of reparations in terms of climate and racial justice work today.
Those examples strike me as really interesting because I think that they show us something about demands and strategy in movements, because when we look at those examples of reparations, none of them are progressive. They're extremely regressive, and they were reparations that were kind of in the service of building the world that we see today with all of its power imbalances and with all the racism. And I think that tells us something about, reparations is never going to be a kind of sacred magic bullet. It's not this sort of inherently progressive demand. But why it's so important is because of the history of the cause for reparations. So I think we sometimes in movements, in campaigning, we get hung up on communications, like we're going to find some magical slogan, and we get hung up on the kind of ethically perfect demand, rather than actually looking at the concrete history. There's a movement behind this thing. When we look at the calls for reparations today and what the history of those movements are, is actually completely different. So I think what this shows us is the importance of looking at the concrete when we're making demands and when we're kind of planning our strategy or our pathway towards justice. We're not looking for some kind of perfect solution. We're not looking for something that's always been the way forward. Reparations is meaningful within a context and within a history of movements that have organized around this. And so it's very interesting that there are all these different forms of reparations, and some of them are incredibly regressive. And I think the other thing that those examples from history tell us is humans do make the world. These are huge structural processes that were made that built the world that we live in today. And I think there's such a kind of mindset that we're fed in current society that this is kind of just natural. This is just how society progresses. We can't really change things that much, or we can only change things to a certain extent. But then when you look at those examples of reparations, they completely restructured the world. And now we live in the aftermath of that. And the flip side of that is we can restructure the world towards the ends that we care about.
I love some of what you're saying there, Oonagh. And I'd like to pick up on the point that 2 of the examples given were punitive. And I'd really like us to think about who we're punishing in the examples where we punish. And are they the people that should be punished? And in the example of the UK paying reparations to slave owners, one might think that slave owners could have been punished, but they weren't. Ordinary citizens were punished and had to pay for the loss of what was seen as property. I'm also interested in the fact that these examples that we've given of reparations that were asked for historically don't seem to have a real sense of a process, of a conversation that includes all of the parties that are involved. So in a way, it is the most powerful, the victors, that are able to ask for what they feel they have lost. And because of the way society is structured, because of the power relations that existed at that time, they were able to extract what they wanted. And that's also the case when we look at slave owners, although it's a bit more concealed, it's not as clear. But they were the ones with the power, and they were able plantocracies were able to say to the British, well, you can't abolish slavery unless you compensate us for what we will have lost.
I think that also tells us something. It's a lesson, isn't it, for going forward? What should reparations in service of justice look like? And if we were to start a process of reparations that was led by the people that benefited from the inequality, and it's just people, governments of the global north saying, oh, well, this is how much charity we want to offer to the victims of colonialism and slavery, then it's going to continue to perpetuate all the same problems that already existed.
So what might reparations that actually troubled and that didn't just accept power relations as they are now look like? What might that look like if the Haitians, for example, had been able to say to the French, you've used our labour, you've taken us from our place of origin, you owe us, rather than the other way around.
And that is the conversation that is happening now, isn't it? That various, in particular, a lot of the Caribbean island nations are beginning to turn around and say that. I think it's interesting to think about as well that Britain at the time chose to pay slaveholders, making a choice in a particular direction. In the US, they promised the 3 acres and a mule, but that never materialized, which I think kind of comes back to what you were saying about making choices and who holds power in certain situations. If say, in Britain, the decision was, we want to abolish slavery and slaveholding, and the cost of that is this thing, and they chose to pay that cost. So what now is the context that we're living in terms of thinking about what is the price we're willing to pay for the kind of society we want to live in?
That is the question about the kind of society we want to live in. So with the example of the British government paying the slaveholders, it was like, how do we make sure that the people who are profiting maintain their class position? How do we make sure that the economic structure remains as close to what it was before, while doing what we need to stop the complete destabilization of society because of the demands for the end of slavery? And I think that's also another danger with when we look at potential reparations for the future, is we know that those people who do profit from current inequalities and who are still holding the wealth that was generated through slavery and colonialism are not going to be running to let go of that wealth. We know that there will be a process of co-optation, there will be a process of trying to figure out what's the kind of the smallest concession we can make, or how can we create structures to look like reparations that absolutely maintain the economic hierarchy and the racialized hierarchy that we have in the world. So one form of this that we've already seen is governments in the global north suggesting that they'll pay aid payments as debt, as loans, so creating debt in the global south rather than creating wealth in the global south. So I think that that question of what's the price to pay for the society we want to live in, the focus there needs to be the society that we want to live in.
I come back to the fact that it wasn't a conversation. It was just the victors, those with power, being able to exact the price they thought that was fit. So we do need to change society, because we can see right now in this moment that it's more polarized than it's ever been. And we need to include a lot more people in the conversation about how do we repair damage and harm that has been wrought upon others. I've been reading a really interesting book by Saidiya Hartman, and it's called Lose Your Mother. It's billed as a journey along the Atlantic slave trade, and it's one of the most interesting books on this topic that I've read in years. And she talks very widely about enslavement and from lots of really interesting angles. And I'd like to just read a quote. It's quite long, but I'd like to just share some of what she says. And she says, "The enslaved knew that freedom had to be taken. It was not the kind of thing that could ever be given to you. The kind of freedom that could be given to you could just as easily be taken back. Freedom is the kind of thing that required you to leave your bones on the hills at Brimsby, or to burn the cane fields, or to live in a garret for 7 years, or to stage a general strike, or to create a new republic. It is won and lost again and again. It is a glimpse of possibility, an opening, a solicitation without any guarantee of duration before it flickers and then is extinguished. The demands of the slave on the present have everything to do with making good the promise of abolition, and this entails much more than the end of property in slaves. It requires the reconstruction of society, which is the only way to honour our debt to the dead. This is the intimacy of our age with theirs, an unfinished struggle. To what end does one conjure the ghost of slavery, if not to incite the hopes of transforming the present? Given this, I refuse to believe that the slave's most capacious political claims or wildest imaginings are for back wages or for debt relief. I love what she says, because she combines lots of struggles, working class struggles, with the slave struggle for freedom. And on that basis, I think we need to think about how to construct a new society that has greater freedoms for a greater number of people.
Yeah, that seems to really connect with what you were saying in the last episode, where you talked about reparations and not just being about financial means. It was also about repairing harm, repairing damage, and kind of going back to what you were saying, what like the 3 examples that everyone gave. What are the things we learned from those examples that feel like things we can take forward?
Yeah, you're right. So in the first episode, we talked about the wider forms of reparation, that they might go beyond monetary transactional payments, and that it might involve the ways we are in society, the way we organise. And there's a UK reparations activist and scholar, Kofi Mawuli-Klu, who reflects that when we look at historical examples of reparations to date, like the 3 examples that we've given, none of them rocked the boat. None of them changed the systems of oppression we live in. And that's, for many of the reasons that we've been talking about now, in that the terms were dictated by those who were in power. So they were very much about maintaining the status quo. I think what those examples also show, though, is that it's possible to pay reparations even when sums are extraordinary, or we're asking people who probably aren't the right people to be paying reparations to pay those reparations. So, for example, in the Haiti reparations, one of the poorest countries in the world somehow managed to repay an extraordinary amount of money. It took them a long time, but those reparations were paid. And equally, as British taxpayers, we've repaid slave owners. And again, it took us a long time and we weren't aware that we were doing it. But we've repaid those reparations. So I think what they show is that there is an ability to pay, even if it's not a reasonable one, or it's even a right one. And we need to reflect on that and think, if we were actually to frame reparations, both not just as a monetary transactional thing, but also in a scenario where it wasn't about people in power telling us how much money we needed to pay them, but rather social movements who were building, wanting to build a different future and costing things quite differently. Those are all very much possible, given that, we've paid for stuff that seemed impossible.
How would that answer the criticism that often comes up when talking about reparations, is that individuals are being asked to pay for something that they personally didn't hold responsibility for? So why should this conversation be happening with some of those people? And are they the right people being asked?
And it's such a big question, because it also touches on things like, why do we even pay taxes? Like why do we contribute to build the society that we want to live in? And, people have different views on whether or not we should pay taxes. But ultimately, I think we can all agree that if we want to create a world that is a good place to live in, we all need to contribute to that, right? And maybe we contribute to varying amounts. Ideally, those with the most money are the ones who are paying the most, because that inequality in society isn't something that we want to perpetuate or to kind of maintain. But at the end of the day, I think if you're committed to a community, you as an individual will give and take from that community, right? So for me, it's important we're all giving and we're all taking.
I agree with what you're saying, but I think there's a larger question to ask. Did Britain and its citizens benefit from the slave trade? Answer is a resounding yes. So it's a bigger picture for me. It's a bigger story. Some nations are weaker, are impoverished, and that is structurally so because of the power that other nations have held over them, and that includes how we've extracted some reparation payments in the past. So it's not an individual question. It's not a personal question. It's a national question. It's a group question. That's one part of my answer. But the other part is that, as Sadia talks about in her book, if we acknowledge human beings' right to dignity, to freedom, to fair wages, then this kind of constructive dialogue between all parties will lead to greater freedoms for all. It won't just benefit those that we think we are paying reparations to. It sets a different principle. It's part of changing society and building the kind of society we want to see, we want to be a part of.
Yeah, there's something for me there about the kind of people being pitted against each other as well, and that like solidarity across classes and movements and things that the way that society kind of conditions us, we start to think it's like it's all of us out against each other and there's like not enough for everyone, so we've got to fight one another for it. But actually it's so important to remember, exactly like Edwina's saying, you know, that the transformational potential of this work is of benefit for working class people across borders, across countries. You know, we need to stop seeing each other in this kind of like us and them kind of mentality and focus on who holds the power and the wealth.
So given that the call for reparations is happening now and at the moment, where is it coming from? Why are people talking about it? Why is it important to engage with it?
There are a couple of things that I think Quakers can learn and things that are very important. The first of these is that if we think about the Caricom 10-point plan, it speaks about a process of national and international reconciliation.
So who are Caricom?
Caricom are the Caribbean community, and they've come up with a 10-point plan for reparatory justice, and they've set up a reparations commission. And I think that their plan is very comprehensive and very wide-ranging, and I think Quakers can learn a lot from that. It isn't just about money. Money is there, but it's a wider ask. So their first demand is for a full, formal apology. And I think Quakers can learn a lot from that because they have yet to apologise for their role in the slave trade. And lots of other faith organisations have done so already. So this is something that Quakers might consider.
Yeah, I think the important thing for me is the listening and the being guided by the people who are impacted by this and the people who have been developing strategies to work towards a just world. And I think actually a really good example that I heard a friend mention at yearly meeting was the war in Ukraine and the way that British people and Quakers mobilized immediately. The people in Ukraine said, we need this. And people just gave the money, you know, set up the schemes, just responded straight away. No one said, oh, if we support these victims of war, then where will it ever end? will we have to support these victims of war? And there weren't any of those kind of like niggly questions about the detail of it. So I think to kind of go back to, we talked in episode 1 a little bit about some of the kind of common worries around reparations and this kind of thing of like, who will really pay, who is really responsible, when will it end? Will everyone be making reparations for everything? Things like Caricom's plan, the fact that these movements already exist, it kind of means we don't need to spiral into all of those questions. We can go to the people who are organizing for justice and say, what do you need? And there's a very clear answer.
I think that's really important. I think it's really important, as we were saying earlier in this conversation, to have a wide conversation that includes those people that aren't usually included. And this is what is also important about Caricom's plan. So their third demand is for an Indigenous Peoples Development Programme. And that demand recognises that genocide and land appropriation went hand in hand. And I think that Quakers have put a lot of work into land appropriation and loss and damage and climate justice. And these things are all related. So I think that Quakers can think about where there is a natural fit, where issues are being raised that they already work on, that they already have some expertise in. Another demand is for cultural institutions. And part of this demand is to actually unpick the truth and have a way of displaying that, of showing that, so that others can see what is the truth. And I think that Quakers have started to do that within themselves. They're looking at troubling their history, at thinking about what aspects of our history that we've accepted are actually true. How much do they tell a complete picture? And so I think that because they're already working on these issues, it might be easier for them to work with others in telling their stories.
I think an important thing that Quakers and everyone can also learn from the movements for reparations is the acknowledgement of the gravity of what has happened. Because I think often, particularly in relation to climate in this country, we talk as if the apocalypse is on the horizon. The worst thing that could ever happen is in the future, and we're kind of scrambling to prevent that future. And for me, what I learned from movements in the Global South, movements for reparations, and from learning about the history of colonialism is that in many ways we already live in the aftermath of the apocalypse. The apocalypse already happened for vast swathes of the world in the form of colonialism and slavery. And once I had absorbed, the real gravity of what happened, the extent of the genocide, the extent of the ecological destruction that occurred, it shifted my focus a little bit. It shifted my focus from kind of future generations of people in the global north to the people in the global south who are suffering right now. And it also kind of strangely took me out of panic mode as well. It put me in a more kind of constructive mindset of, well, these are the things that have happened. We live in that reality. We live in the aftermath of that, and our world is shaped by that. So how do we concretely begin to remake the world rather than kind of panicking to prevent the catastrophe that is in the future? Like, the catastrophe is all around us. It's happened already. And that's kind of something that we really need to understand.
In support of what you're saying, Oonagh, one of the points in the Caricom 10-point plan is repatriation. And that is in absolute acknowledgement of the fact that the transatlantic slave trade is the largest forced migration in human history. It has no parallel in terms of people's inhumanity to each other. So yes, it's already happened. The crisis has been happening to some people for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Given that Quakers have expressed an intention to make reparations, what can people learn from the calls for reparations that have been happening around the world?
So at Quakers in Britain, we've been working on loss and damage as our priority climate justice issue for a couple of years now. It will continue to be our priority issue for the coming year. And we do a lot of work on it through the Make Polluters Pay coalition campaign. So my invitation would be for friends who feel inspired by the recent discussions on reparations to come along and find out more about this example of climate reparations that Quakers are working on, the ways in which we are participating in the coalition campaign, and the ways in which we're listening to climate vulnerable countries who are telling us that they've been asking for a loss and damage fund for 30 years, and their asks are falling on deaf ears, and that we can help for those deaf ears to hear their calls.
I wanted to ask you a particular question, Edwina, because I understand that you're part of the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum, which is part of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. And how as a group is that kind of beginning to look at this from this faith perspective of understanding and listening and kind of moving forward? Is it part of that conversation? How are people thinking about this in that group?
It is part of the conversation, and actually I found that group really helpful in sharpening my own analysis and helping me to move forward on this issue. So different denominations within this group are working on separate but related issues, and different denominations lead on separate issues. So the Baptists have led on the Sam Sharp lectures, which have really anchored the call for reparations. We're also, as a group, working on current manifestations of racism. So we're looking at what's happening in Britain today to Black people and brown people in the UK today that has its origins in the slave trade, in the unequal power relations that were instigated in that period and continue to be remade and nurtured in our time period now. And so we protest against injustices as they occur, and we seek to link them to the narrative of racism.
Wow, absolutely fascinating conversation, and really took me back. So many things that I kind of knew, but I'd forgotten. I mean, that Haiti is so important. I remember only finding out about that fairly recently, and it being it's so significant part of world history that really should be more well known.
Yeah, I feel like there was a lot that I didn't know about. And so it was kind of good to have a conversation where I learned something. And that's, I think, part of what this project is for Quakers, is also learning from people who've already been talking about this, and maybe it's not been part of a wider conversation, or it's only just sort of bubbling up and coming to light a bit more. And so it was good to kind of get started on understanding where to go next in learning about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And opening up that different perspectives. And that's kind of what comes into a little bit of the conversation that's the next part of this episode, where I talked to Siobhán Haire. And one of the things we talked about was how Quakers came to the position around reparations and how that all happened, but also what her thoughts might be on how that will be shaped moving forward, and what a meaningful reparations process looks like for Quakers. I'm with Siobhán Haire. Do you want to say a little bit more about yourself and what you do?
So I'm Siobhán. I have recently stopped being clerk of Britain Yearly Meeting. So I was in that role at Yearly Meeting in 2022. And then for the 6 years before that, I was also at the table, because I was the second assistant clerk for 3 years, and then the first assistant clerk for 3 years, apart from 1 year when I had a baby and took a year off. So that's who I was. I am now the deputy recording clerk of Britain Yearly Meeting, although that happened after Yearly Meeting in 2022.
Now, I think Yearly Meeting is a kind of a fascinating thing, because we set themes and we have a sense of what might happen. Quakers are given materials to explore ahead of time. but nothing is ever decided. We're not necessarily coming together to decide X. We're coming together having done some preparation, unknowing. Nobody knows what the outcome is going to be. So was that really the case with this issue? Well, we knew that stuff like racial justice, maybe reparations even, were going to come up at this yearly meeting. Did you have a sense of what might happen?
We didn't go into that session thinking we're going to come out of this with the decision to deeply consider making financial or other reparations, which is how it sort of came out in the minute for the transatlantic slave trade. We had been on this journey for several yearly meetings, going from a consideration of privilege a few years back, and that kind of pushed forward into making a decision to committing to become an anti-racist church in 2021. We sort of thought it was likely that this would be our last yearly meeting for a little bit of time, that we would look at race and issues of inequality or privilege and disenfranchisement. It wasn't approached as like this is it, right? You've got to make some sort of significant thing happen. And we have had yearly meetings like that in fairly recent memory. I mean, the one that people talk about probably the most regularly is in 2009, when we committed to supporting and performing same-sex marriages. And I think that possibly was one where there'd been more thinking through or more anticipation that is a decision that could have come. But certainly from my perspective, there wasn't a big kind of there wasn't a great sense of anticipation that this is what would come out of the session, which in hindsight sort of feels like, well, what were you all doing? Were you not preparing for it? And we absolutely were. And I have to say that the work and the real thought of planning the agenda and planning the preparation materials and the preparation sessions, which we had this year, that work is largely done by Agenda Committee. And although I'm present, or the Clerk of Yearly Meeting is present at Agenda Committee throughout the year when they're planning for yearly meeting, actually that committee really took that work on and found a way to frame a consideration of race and inequality, and the sort of the lasting legacy of that, which then pushed us on to that decision. But I don't think any of us thought it was an inevitable outcome of that session.
Part of your role as clerk is to write, as you say, that minute that almost summarizes everything. It's what is the outcome of the yearly meeting. And you ended up as a team writing a minute that then got accepted, that had stuff in it, as you say, around reparations. How over the period of yearly meeting, how did that kind of emerge for you? Like, were there key points where you heard voices and you thought, okay, here's some really spiritually grounded ministry about this thing that seems to be pushing us in this direction?
It's a great question, and I don't know if I have a great answer, actually. I think you can feel when a ministry is speaking the truth. And I think you can sometimes feel when ministry might be slightly distracted, or might be close to the truth but not quite there, or might be motivated by other things. That said, I don't particularly. I mean, I think there was actually at yearly meeting as a whole, there was a real richness from what I can recall, and a real depth to a lot of ministry and a lot of the sessions. We came out of them exhausted, but also quite enriched by what we had heard. I think there's an element. There's probably two elements insofar as I would want to analyze it, which I wouldn't particularly want to overanalyze what you do as a clerk, or what I did as a clerk. One element of it is like distillation, like what are we hearing again and again? And then there's maybe an element of alchemy, where you're putting things together and sort of you can't just write down all the different bits of ministry, right? That doesn't get you to a minute that's helpful, or an output from the session that kind of shows you the way forward necessarily. There needs to be a little bit more that I think sometimes comes from you in saying, okay, well, we've got this kind of ministry over here, and then we had that idea coming over there. And actually in the previous session, someone mentioned this thing, which 3 other people have picked up on. And that's the sort of thing that tends to be persuasive in terms of, yes, I will include that in the minute. I have to say, I really second-guessed myself in writing that minute, particularly writing the sentence which kind of enacted the idea that we would consider making reparations, financial and otherwise. And I sort of passed my laptop across to Paul Parker, and I sort of said, am I allowed to write this? Because it felt like who was I to say, yeah, we're gonna think about paying some serious money here. And he said, well, something along the lines of, well, if you can't, who can? Like at this time and in this place, you're the person that needs to write it if it needs to be written.
But of course, I mean, one of the great things about the process, and I've seen this myself in other big Quaker forums, is you then present that minute, right? Like you then present the minute to everyone, and you hear people who say, I don't like that bit, or can you change that bit, or what, I don't understand that bit. And then you have to go and tweak and tweak and tweak. But it's not your minute. Do you know what I mean?
It's owned by the meeting.
And what was interesting is, as you say, that was quite a big thing to write, but the response from the room, which I think indicated that you got it right, wasn't everyone going, oh, she wrote what? What did you say?
Yeah, there definitely were comments on the minute, which almost inevitably improves what you've written, but not many, if any, on the big idea of considering payment of reparations, which, yes, as you say, is like reassuring that you've kind of read the sense of the meeting correctly.
So you've done it. The minute's been written. You're walking away. What are you, as a friend on the bench, as some people like to say, then thinking, oh, okay, yeah, what happens now? Like, what do you think the outcome is next?
I think it feels like a right decision. I think it feels like an opportunity to do something that is, actions, not words. I think it won't be done well unless it is done thoughtfully. I think if I can say a list of things that I think it can't be, I think it cannot be entirely a financial matter. I also think it cannot be a matter that is entirely sort of devoid of financial consideration. I think we will never come to a time where any of us can say, right, that's it, we've done it. We've repaired the harm that was done. Because the harm that was done for centuries. The colonial project is half a millennium old, and we still live in its shadow. And so it will take a commensurate, I hope not an equal, but in similar scale time to unpick and repair that harm. And this is a step for us on that journey. I also don't think it's a project we can undertake on our own. I think if this results in Quakers talking to Quakers, assigning some sort of financial value for our participation, paying that money somewhere and moving on, it will not have been a good process. And it will not lead us to a place of having made a meaningful reparation, which is, I think, what the minute asked for in the end. So I think there's a head element and a heart element. And I think we're really good at understanding that in our business process, in that to make a decision, you need information about facts. But we also need that kind of listening with our hearts and willingness to be convinced of a different point of view. And we need to do that as a group. At work, we welcomed Anthony Reddy, who's a professor at the University of Oxford and a liberation theologian. And he talked to us about reparation. The thing that was something that really struck me in what he said was that reparation isn't about what you do on your own, or in our case, on our own as a community of Quakers in the UK. It's about what you do as a collective in dialogue with others. And in fact, we probably shouldn't have the defining answer on how we might make those reparations. I think we need to listen and to ask. And I think the right people to ask are most likely to be the people whose lives have been impacted negatively by the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and finding a way to have a meaningful conversation locally and nationally with people who live with that legacy is a really crucial part of whatever process comes next.
It's good to go back and think about how we got here and what led to that Quaker decision in 2021.
Yeah, even though that interview was from a while ago, I found it perhaps more useful listening back now, as it reminded me where this comes from. As so much of it has kind of moved on quite quickly from my perspective, and so much has happened since. So it's really good to go back and kind of ground yourself in how we got here.
Yeah, and the general sense of the meeting, of how the decision was made, rather than just thinking about it in the sort of practical, have we set these things up? Do we have all these resources in place for people? But actually, no, it is very much that sense of it being grounded in a religious experience of this is an important thing for us to be doing.
And since then, even though it took us a little bit by surprise, Quakers have been doing quite a lot. Do you want to give us a few highlights of what's happened?
Sure. So there is now a reparations working group. It's kind of looking at how to support Quakers nationally on this work. And local Quaker meetings have been doing quite a bit to start looking at their history, links to the slave trade. It was testimony from Lancaster meeting that helped set this off, as well as Siobhán mentioned, and Bristol in particular have been looking at their links with the slave trade, and then obviously doing lots more learning through Woodbrook courses, which I'm sure you will talk about in a minute. And people have been making greater links with particularly Caribbean groups who are exploring reparations, particularly from a faith angle, and looking at sort of church history and church involvement around the slave trade, linking up ecumenically around it as well, and then thinking about campaigns for reparations around climate loss and damage. Actually, Quakers have been quite heavily involved in campaigning for a loss and damage fund at the various UN climate talks over the last few years. And there's been some success around that, although money has yet to be found. But the idea of doing it is there.
Yeah, and if what we've done at Woodbrook is we've pulled all of the stuff we're doing in this area together on one page, so woodbrook.org.uk/anti-racism. And for us as an educational institution, it's really important that we are sharing how we're going through the process. We're not just going around and saying, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. So even though we've been focusing on anti-racism work and re-examining Quaker history, contextualizing things, exploring the theology behind it and all of this, and bringing in different speakers, we've also been talking about like how we're changing to be an anti-racist organization and the journey that we're going on, and trying to be really open about sharing that, because certainly I think this process can't be done in a way where it's like, right, we've got the answer, let's plow on. It has to be kind of something that's constantly worked on and constantly critiqued, and often actually the best way forward isn't always obvious.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that commitment to keep learning and keep listening and then keep going and learning and listening as you go, rather than be like, well, we've done all the listening we're going to do now, so we can just take action, isn't really how it's going to be. And I've certainly found, thinking about the various resources that Edwina mentioned in particular, learning from different groups, and obviously hosting a podcast. I've been listening to various podcasts, and one I found really useful was the Human Resources podcast with Moya Lothian McLean. And other people have recommended the Guardian's Cotton Capital podcast as quite a good one as well. So those are two that I'd probably really recommend to have a look at.
Yeah, so we'll put that in the description for the podcast, with also the various books that Edwina mentioned and links to various resources at Woodbrook and Britain Uni Meeting.
And you can find us on social media at British Quakers and at Woodbrook UK. Using hashtag a Quaker Take, or you can email me on social media at quaker.org.uk.
And all the information about this podcast can be found at quaker.org.uk/podcast. That is it for episode 2. It's such an important topic. We're definitely going to be revisiting it, but we are considering that a close as we launch a new season in 2024. And I think the only thing left to say really is thank you very much for listening.
Go well, friends.